All right, welcome back to track 2 with our final talk today before lunch. And before we get into the session, session sponsor for this session is Wiz. But I'm going to tell you something that you may not know, which is that Forward CloudSec is only possible because of the great sponsors that Forward CloudSec has. And they are actually here because they want to talk to you. This is where you make the noise. Okay, we practiced this before lunch, and clearly I just didn't give a strong enough cue. But even if you are not a buyer, the sponsors are here to talk with you about their products. Be curious, wander around during the lunch, ask them what they do. If you don't know what they do, if you haven't seen their product in a while, ask to see a demo. And with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Jason Cao from Fog Security, with a talk title that certainly can only exist at Forward CloudSec, The Duplicitous Nature of AWS Identity and Access Management, IAM. Give him a big hand to welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, appreciate it. Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Cao, for those of you who don't know. I work at Fog Security, I'm the founder, and I'm talking to you about the duplicitous nature of AWS Identity and Access Management, IAM. So a little bit about me. I ran a team that built out cloud security at Fidelity Investments. And then I did offensive cloud security consulting at Praetorian. I led security research and solutions engineering at CloudQuery. And lastly, I'm now building better data perimeters and preventing cloud ransomware at Fog Security. But you're not here to listen to me talk about myself. You're here to listen to me talk about IAM. So let's get going. So the agenda today is we're going to first talk about AWS IAM and the shared responsibility model and how that affects our understanding and how we secure IAM. Next, we're going to talk about duplicate IAM permissions. And then we'll talk about some of the AWS-provided resolutions and what it looks like in AWS and in practice. We'll then talk about some of the complexity of IAM, which I'm sure you're aware of. And then lastly, we'll talk about best practices management of IAM. So AWS IAM. Show of hands, a little bit of participation here. So if you're watching live, you can't see all the hands in the room. But who has written AWS IAM policies before? And by that, I mean at least one IAM policy. Okay. So mostly everyone in the room. I promise I'm not lying. So who uses their own IAM policies and not just AWS managed policies? Okay, a fair number as well. Who has written a resource-based policy such as an S3 bucket policy or SQSQ policy or a KMS key policy? Great, a lot of hands. And then, sorry, this might get a little bit tiring. Who finds AWS IAM complex? Okay, a lot of hands as well. And the last fun question, who finds AWS IAM to be simple? Do you want to give this presentation? Anyways, I also find AWS IAM complex, so I am in that boat as well. So a quick primer in AWS. There are over 18,000 permissions and 200 plus services. Chart on the right basically shows the growth over the last few years from 2020. So 7,000 around in 2020, and it goes all the way up to 18,000 in 2025. I checked this morning at breakfast, as some of you may have seen me with my laptop out. As of this morning, there are 18,724 permissions and 16,975 API methods. And that covers over 444 service prefixes from looking at the console. I'm not great at math, but doing a little math problem here. There's 200 plus services and 400 plus service prefixes, so there must be at least one service that has multiple service prefixes. And that's some of the talk that we'll talk about in a little bit. So AWS IAM, most of you know what this looks like, so I'll be quick. Quick primer on what it looks like, right? There's different types of policies. The part on the right is what a policy may look like. I love that. I love the domain language and how it looks like, how to break it down, right? So in this case, we have SQS add permission, Lambda add permission, Lambda list, IAM get started. You may have seen some of those before in the past. Again, we're not really going to focus on that, just a primer on what AWS IAM can look like. What we're going to talk about next, though, is a shared responsibility model. And you may have heard this a lot, right? AWS talks about it, different cloud providers talk about it, and this is actually pulled directly from AWS. So different ways to look at this, and we won't go into all the detail here, is we can think of it as the customers, so us, most of us in this room, are responsible for security in the cloud, right? And AWS is responsible for security of the cloud. You may have also heard of what's above the line, what's below the line, but ultimately, the customers and AWS works together to secure everything that you have in cloud. The other thing that we look at, right, is AWS provides tools for you to use. So tools like AWS IAM, block public access, and there's an implied understanding that AWS provides documentation for you to understand and how to use our tooling, right? Personally, I've spent countless of hours going through AWS documentation, And I'd use the IKEA furniture example here, right? When you buy a rug from IKEA, there may not be instructions, right? You just take it out of the plastic packaging and you unravel it, right? But when you buy a bookcase or some other piece of furniture with a name that I probably can't pronounce, there are instructions on how to use it. And that's what we think about with AWS. We think about the shared responsibility model. I love dictionary definitions, so we'll start with this. What is the meaning of duplicate or duplicity, right? Does it consist of something that has where we see double? And in this case, right, duplicity, the second example is the quality or state of being double or doubled. So this wouldn't be a talk in 2025 without looking at AI. So this is Perplexity, and I know some of you may prefer ChatGPT or other ones. But duplicate IAM permissions explained by one of these is basically situations where a user group or role is granted the same or overlapping permissions, and that's not exactly what we're talking about today. And just for those who use ChatGPT, ask the same exact question, and it talks about redundant or overlapping permissions granted to a user group or role, et cetera, in AWS IAM. Won't go too much into details there. And again, these are pulled recently, so I promise they're not from a while ago. Show me the meaning. What does it actually mean? What is our definition? And that's what we're actually going to talk about today. 2 or more AWS IAM permissions that correspond to the same outcome or effect. In some cases, managing one permission does not have any effect on the other permission. And thus, what makes it complicated or complex is denying one permission does not affect the usage of the other permission. Quick primer, what we're not covering. These are different ways of granting permissions to an IAM user. You may have seen this, and yes, it's an IAM user. In this case, you can put an inline policy. You can use a managed policy directly to the user. Group inline policy if the user is in a group. Attach policy directly to a group. Also resource-based policies if it's in the same account, but that's not really what we're going to talk about today. Another example of what we're not going to talk about, shout out to Aidan Steele and Daniel Grislak. I probably just butchered his name, so I apologize for bringing this to my attention. There are different ways of reading or retrieving data in DynamoDB. Not only DynamoDB get item, query scan, you can also retrieve data with put item, update item, delete item, depending on if you change the return values field on how you make that call. Additionally, you can use DynamoDB batch get item and PartQL select. So there are many different ways in Dynamo to retrieve data or read data. Again, we're also not covering S3, specifically deleting object. S3, you can delete object versioning. You can also use put lifecycle configuration to control lifecycle expiration rules, which is another way to delete data in S3. Earlier this year, we covered some ransomware, and as you may be aware, S3 deletion of data is one aspect of ransomware so that you lose your data. So now that we've talked about AWS IAM, we've talked about the shared responsibility model, and what we're not going to cover, here's what we are going to cover in duplicate permissions. And each of these slides will have the same format of multiple different ways of doing the same exact action. This one's a little bit older, and you may have seen this in an email notification. This is for AWS accounts and modifying contact information for account. So there's AWS portal, modify account, account put contact information. And similarly, there was one for AWS portal, modify account, and account put alternate contact information. So in this case, right, you could modify the alternate information, including security, billing, and operations. Next, we'll focus on Identity Center, which is a service formerly known as SSO, and there's an effect of adding permissions for permission set. SSO put permissions policy is one way of doing it, and in this case, looking at inline, there's SSO put inline policy to permission set. And we're going to go rather quickly through some of these to show some of the impact. Next, we have Identity Center again, managing a user's group membership, right? So looking at Identity Store, create group membership, SSO directory, add member to group. Now we move on to SES, which is simple email service. They have 2 different versions of an API and a lot of duplicate permissions there. So SES send raw email and SES send email also do the same thing of sending a raw email. There's also templated email sending if you want to do SES send templated email or SES send email again here. One of the things about SES is you can not only use it, but you can manage it. So SES has SES update account setting enabled or SES put account setting attributes. And this allows you to enable or disable email sending across the entire SES account in a region. Another management piece is looking at email identity access. So managing access to an SES identity, such as email address, you can put identity policy with SES. You can also create an email identity policy and SES update email identity policy. And that wouldn't be complete without also deleting. So SES delete identity policy, SES delete email identity policy are another example of duplicate permissions. We also have messaging queues in AWS called Simple Queue Service. And in this case, right, this is the one that I probably gave as an example to some of you that I've talked to in the hallways or previously at lunch or dinner or even breakfast, right? There's actually two different ways of changing the resource-based policy in SQS, and you may be aware of this. SQS add permission, very similar to Lambda, right? When you add a permission, you pass in a couple attributes and you can grant another account potential access to your queue. There's also SQS set queue attributes, which if you pass in a policy, that also allows you to set the policy itself on SQS. And we have more details about this in a little bit. Another duplicate permission encryption management. So if you use KMS and you are familiar with a key grant, we won't cover key grants in too much detail, but key grants are another way of controlling access to a KMS key. So you have KMS key policies, KMS key grants, which aren't available on the console, but you can pull through APIs. And if you're aware of this, right, AWS services often use key grants to authorize themselves to use, to do operations on your behalf. And again, there's a little bit more nuance about key grants, right, such as nested key grants and how they use permissions, et cetera. But there are two different permissions that actually remove access to a KMS key by deleting a key grant. There's KMS retire grant and KMS revoke grant. So far, we've covered a couple different services, So we've covered Simple Email Service, SES. We've covered Identity Center, formerly known as AWS SSO. We've covered Simple Queue Service, SQS, Key Management Service, KMS, and AWS Account. So let's think about some of the trends, right? Why does this happen in AWS? From a date perspective, right? Maybe they're just older services, which is not necessarily the case here, right? SQS was 2004, SES was early 2011, SSO was 2017, and Identity Center or the rebrand was 2022. Types of permissions, which we'll talk about in a bit, right? AWS provides different buckets that you can use to categorize your permissions, right? List, read, tagging, write, and permissions management. The previous ones we focus on are most likely to be write or permissions management, some read, but we really didn't look at too much of the list and read permissions there. So now that we've talked about a high-level overview and also a couple examples of duplicate permissions, let's talk about the differences of the permissions there. So again, managing queue permissions, I alluded to this earlier, right? On one side is add permission, what it looks like from an API perspective. The other side is what SQS set queue attributes, and if you can read that, the outline in red is where you pass in the policy, right? For account information, one is console only and one is API only. It also depends on how old your account is or how old your organization is, which makes this a little bit more complicated. One is, again, right, what it looks like in console, and the other one is what it looks like in API. We also have Identity Center. This is an experiment that we ran to see what would happen. One was on API, and the other one was console only as well. So that's similar difference, different service. And then lastly, SES email service. It might be a little bit hard to read in the back, but what you see is if you use, trying to create a policy in AWS, there have SES and SES v2, but the prefix is still the same. Just so you all are aware, a little bit of history. SES v1 was first introduced in 2011, and then SES v2, the API, was introduced in 2020. And the difference for deleting a key grant, this is actually how we grant the permission. So you can create grant permissions to retire a grant via a KMS key grant. So in this case, right, there's two different ways of doing that. You can either add it to the grantee principal or the retiring principal. So the bottom example is a grantee principal, the top one is a retiring principal. And the interesting thing is, I believe you can actually deny this via an IAM policy, but you can't actually grant permissions through an IAM policy. And then KMS revoke grant, permissions via key policy. As some of you are aware, key policies are unique where the permissions must actually be granted in the KMS key policy. And the default key policy you get from AWS is actually delegation policy within your account, which somewhat of an implicit allow, but not quite an explicit allow. So some of the differences that we covered so far, we've talked about how to grant permissions. So for KMS, that's KMS key grant versus KMS key policy. We've talked about API versions, V1 and V2 for SSO, or for SES, Identity Center and SSO, which is a little bit of a rebrand, and console versus API, which is account and Identity Center. In certain cases, right, for console versus API, we've seen this where, although we think the console and API permissions should be exactly the same, there are some examples where AWS will release a service and it's console only or has very limited support, and that is probably the reason why we see some of these changes. So we've covered all those, the differences. Let's talk about how does AWS help us manage duplicate permissions. So this one I actually really liked, and I'll go into a little bit more detail here. In July 2023, 2 years ago, AWS actually tried to retire AWS portal prefix permissions. They sent out email to everyone that was affected, and they actually released a lot of documentation and sent out email, including, if you're using this, there's a bulk policy migrator script you can check. It seems like they held a lot of hands for this, which was fantastic, right? And this note is actually pulled straight from the AWS documentation, basically saying, hey, we retired this, and then a little bit of nuance about whether your account or organization was created at a certain time or not. Another one is IAM condition keys. So I actually reported the SES version thing to AWS Security. Shout out to them. And what they did was they actually implemented an API key, which is probably not how I would do it. But there is a condition key called SES API version. From what I've seen, it is probably the only condition key that has API version in there, and it filters action based off the SES API version. So quick policy snippet on the right on how to use it. Use a string not equals SES API version, version 2. And then in some cases, right, there is documentation only. So if you look at SQS, add permission or set queue attributes, they talk about how to actually deny anyone from changing an SQS queue or resource-based policy. In this note, which I think is great, to remove the ability to change queue permissions, you must deny permission to the add permission, remove permission, and also set queue attributes actions in your IAM policy. Another one is just documentation, so retire grant and revoke grant. There's a lot more documentation here on basically how to deny or what you can do with this. But interesting thing here, right, is required permissions, permission to retire grant is determined primarily by the grant. For details, see this other documentation, but that's something else that we'll see. Another example is this is what AWS calls dual authorization, so this for Identity Center. Hidden in the Identity Center pages, but basically they have the operation on the left and API actions before or after a certain date. So a summary of what AWS has provided, right? We've looked at condition keys, we've looked at documentation, we've looked at console versus API, retirement permissions, and basically if you have things or resources created before or after a certain date. So that being said, let's talk about complexity for duplicate permissions. As some of you are aware, looking through this, right, trying to figure out what's in CloudTrail or not, if I'm looking for, let's say, SQSQ and seeing what policies change, I would have to look for both the set queue attributes and add permission. They don't show up the same in CloudTrail. Another example is for looking at the account. This was the put contact information or the AWS portal permission. And one of the complexities, additional complexity here is that the set contact address is not the same permission as AWS portal modify account. So as you may be aware, right, CloudTrail and IAM do not always have a one-to-one mapping. And then this is something I actually talked to Patrick, I know you're in the crowd, about this morning because I was actually really excited about a release yesterday for the service reference, and we're about to talk about that. The SQS add permission is classified as a permissions management. SQS set queue attributes is classified as write. So if we're looking at classifying our policy or seeing what our IAM principles can do, that doesn't always match up, right? So if I don't give someone SQS add permission, I may think they only have write attributes, and I only give them SQS set queue attributes. But the interesting thing, which I'm alluding to, that popped up yesterday on this release for service references, is if you look at the bottom right corner, that's from their documentation, it's only classified as a write operation, and there's an N of 1, so there's only one category. On the left is something we pulled from the service reference, and if you're unaware, right, the service reference authorization is a huge listing of all the actions, resources, and condition keys available for every single service in AWS. They recently made this programmatically available via JSON files. On the left, they just added these annotations yesterday, and what we see is that it's not just an array, it's not an N of 1, but in this case, the set queue attributes can be both write and a permissions management, which makes sense. There are certain tools out there that do overrides, right? If the permissions don't seem to match up from like our understanding. We've also, I think in the cloud security forum, I've also worked with other people to report some of these were like, hey, this doesn't really match up. This might not be a write action. This seems more like permissions management. And we've seen that a couple times, and there's a lot, again, open source tooling or other tooling that has overrides for those. But in this case, this kind of breaks the model where this isn't consistent, right? Because we see one where it's just an N of 1, and another one where it's an N of 2 or more. And then another one, right, for SSO, put permission policy is classified as permissions management. SSO put inline policy permission set is classified as a write, and the right side example pulling from the console again. So we've talked a lot about the complexity of IAM management and prevention. We're going to talk a little bit more about that, right? So we alluded to complexity of the classification taxonomy of these IAM permissions. We've talked about a little bit, right? Like, if we look at an allow and monitor strategy, what does that look like, right? Do we allow, if the actions are very similar and they're classified very similarly, right? It's easy to block both. For example, if I don't want anyone to modify my SCS account sending attributes, right, I can block both those permissions, right, and that's fairly straightforward. However, if I'm trying to use an API version, that becomes a little bit more complex because as a security team, I really can't tell my developers to use certain APIs, right? We can see RCPs and SCPs, so resource control policy and SCPs. We can set a perimeter as we want, right? And making sure we're creating some sort of data perimeter or infrastructure perimeter. And then lastly, right, what we talked about earlier is like how do we deny action or access to actions? The SQS permission example I'd give is if we're trying to block resource-based policies, yes, we can block SQS add permission, but we really can't block SQS set queue attributes because it does other things outside of just setting policies there. So this moves us to our conclusion. There are duplicate permissions that exist in AWS, and it's not just the same permission in multiple different policies. It's multiple permissions that get us to the same point, right? We've talked a little bit about how to define an IAM strategy, right? Looking at whether it's a deny, whether it's allow but monitor, whether it's an allow. What I'd recommend is from a detection prevention strategy, right? Work with your security tooling, right? And work with other colleagues, et cetera, to figure out exactly what it is. And the last piece, right, is strategy. Purpose-driven IAM configuration and understanding nuance of this is very difficult, right? It helps us understand a holistic strategy, but there's a lot of nuance to IAM. There's a lot of nuance to the permissions, as we exhibited with the duplicate permissions that we've seen. And then lastly, future plans and contact. We've only gone through a couple different services. As we called out, there's over 200 plus services and 18,000 permissions. So there will be future research and tooling for duplicate permissions. We also have more to come for AWS IAM and data perimeters. Reach out if you're interested. Here's my email and my contact information for LinkedIn. And just so you're aware, we plan on doing more in the future to unfog cloud security so they're no longer seeing double. Again, reach out, and if you have any questions, happy to answer them. Thanks for your time.
All right, we have a fair bit of time for questions, if anybody has questions.
Great talk, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
just had a question. It's more related to conditions. Just some background, the reason why I think IAM's a little easier is because that was my job at AWS, so sorry for that. Have you ever dealt with double conditions in an IAM policy statement? And how do you feel about that?
What do you mean by double conditions?
I had a customer ask me if they could make two separate conditions inside of an IAM policy. It took a little work to get it done, but basically the first condition would be like, string not like this, and then string like this, and it would accept two different parameters. So I'm just curious if you ever run into that, and what do you think? Right,
so I can't answer exactly off the top of my head, but I think what happens, right, is when we have multiple conditions within the same IAM policy, to me, it's not quite logical, and this might just be a me problem of like how those interact with each other, right? So if you have the same condition key and you have multiple values within there, or if you do like for all values for like any value, right, that makes it really complicated. So I think to me, right, I like when it's statements with just one, because then I think it's very purpose-driven, right? But then when it gets complex or has more to your point, right, they could have a very specific reason to do that. But for me, like I think that gets really complicated to try to figure out exactly what that policy is doing.
Have you ever tried the verified permissions API and access analyzer to see which condition key wins?
I have not tried verified permissions, but I just got a question about access analyzer, and I'm a huge fan about how it looks at like data perimeters and also the zone of trust.
Other identity and access questions?
In relation to complexity of IAM, how do you feel about permission boundaries, and how does that affect, like when you're basically like a user set to a group and then to a permission boundary, how do you feel that those overlap or take over or whatever based on where they're set?
So this is, again, a personal preference, is I would not use a permission boundary without using an SCP, so I think the combination of those two make it possible, just because of the granularity that is sort of hard to get with just one of them. I think there's also a very interesting nuance in how like permission boundaries evaluate within an account, I think based off like a role and like if you're actually using this, like the assume role part of that. But I think overall, right, like I really like permission boundaries. I think it's a great way to like add a boundary, right? And if you grant someone the ability to create another role, right, you can add the permission boundary and say like, you must have this. And I think that condition key, going back to condition keys, is brilliant, right? It makes total sense, but it sits a little bit outside of like, I think the standardized, how does a condition key affect what the request is, or what does it look for in the request, right?
I think permissions boundaries are one of the least well understood and applied features in the IAM system.
I would also add session policies, which I haven't seen an effective use of yet, but I'm very curious how those work well.
One more here in the front.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Maybe it's an issue with translation from Azure to AWS, but I'm not familiar with the permissions management, like the property that you showed that is showing up as of yesterday. Isn't that what it was? It was showing up as true?
Let me see.
And that was kind of...
This, right?
Right. Is permission management. Can you explain that more in depth?
Yeah, sure. So AWS class, I'll take a step back first. AWS classifies permissions in a couple different buckets. The permission management one is typically tied to like adding a policy, creating a user, or I can't remember exactly how they're classified in IAM. But it's a little bit different from a write. I think the write, to me, is about creating resources, while the permission management is like, okay, am I adding a resource-based policy, right? Like to S3, right? Am I putting a bucket policy that allows access from somewhere else, right? So that's how I see the permission management category, or the bucket of permissions. And that way, if you look at like, you're looking at IAM policies that attach your IAM roles, right? And you're trying to classify them. Is it just someone that has write access, or is it someone who has a little bit more management ability, right? And they can add permissions or grant someone else access, right? And escalate that. Does that answer? Okay.
All right, well, we have quite a bit of time before lunch, but let's go ahead and just give him one more round of applause for a great session.
Thanks.